AMD made a lot of fanfare about CrossFire with the RX 480s, mainly pointing to higher performance on two 480s, which would cost 200 times 2, so $400 or $480 depending, and saying that was better than a single GTX 1080, which is of course a higher cost product, $650 to $700 or more, as we all know with the current product availability. So that was the fanfare at the Macau event and later at Computex with the RX 480s. AMD used the game Ashes of Singularity to benchmark. That's the only one that we saw in sort of a live benchmarking. So we bought our own second RX 480, paired them together. We've got benchmarks for you here. I did more than FPS. We did thermal testing, noise testing, and power testing, and then we've also got the usual FPS benchmarks. And you can find all of these linked in the description below in the article if you want full detail for things that might not be covered in complete depth here. So first off, when does CrossFire work well and why? CrossFire mostly works in games where frames are not interdependent on one another. So games where you have really heavy post-FX, post-processing, and temporal effects that span from frame A to frame B, like temporal analysis of samples of pixels for things like anti-aliasing, things like that. Those types of effects and game environments do not necessarily work well with multi-GPU setups, whether it's CrossFire or SLI, and this is assuming sort of an LDA or maybe even some MDA types of games. So the reason for that is because the frames are interdependent. So with AFR, alternate frame rendering, GPU 1 renders a frame, GPU 2 renders a frame, they put them together, they output it, that's your frame rate. So this is where, with post-processing, you kind of lose some of that performance, and you can actually have negative scaling, and we'll show that here. So this table you're looking at is our bench with all the hardware that we use for these tests. You can find that again linked in the description below with the full charts. First we'll talk about thermals. So thermals for multi-GPU configurations can kind of go through the roof with tight spaces. Blower fans help a bit by nature of being more exposed to the air, and AMD's got a cutout in the back of their cards that further helps with some breathability. We tested CrossFire with our cards 2 slots apart or 1 full usable slot gapped, and checked on thermals, peak temperatures, and things like that. This first chart is a zoomed out look at the frequency of GPU 1, GPU 2, and the temperature of GPU 1, which is the hottest of the pair, and this is an absolute temperature, so it's not the delta value that we're going to show in equilibrium charts. Note that the clock rate fluctuates when exceeding actually, the fluctuations themselves exceed a range of 100 megahertz in some cases, so we see a pretty big swing, and that can cause spurious frame output and low frame times when the cards are under more duress. And to offset this, just like with the NVIDIA cards, AMD throttles its clock rate temporarily for a heavy thermal reduction. So this process is actually pretty normal between AMD and NVIDIA, and it repeats ad infinitum until you either stop gaming or things have smoothed out. But let's zoom in to make it a little more clear what's going on. So we've distorted the scale here, and for good reason. The temperature scale is now 70 to 90, and that helps see the spikes with greater resolution. And the time scale has been restricted to 500 to 800 seconds rather than the full 0 to 800. Notice that every temperature reduction is accompanied by a brief frequency reduction, and the two are directly related in their function in this way. If you look at them in the charts, the second card seems to run at a lower frequency throughout the test and isn't matching the frequency of the first GPU necessarily. And if we look at our charts from the single RX 480 review, we see that similar frequency and thermal values are being hit, but the RX 480 does breathe better overall, and that's obvious because it's not being blocked by a second card. So here's a chart looking at the quote-unquote equilibrium temperature values, basically average peak thermals for a single card, all the other cards, and the CrossFire RX 480s. Power draw, of course, is a very important metric when looking at multiple GPUs, because even though you're increasing your potential for performance, you're also drawing a lot more power. So this shows total system power draw in volt amps, or apparent power consumption, and that means it's for the complete system, not just the GPUs. And what we're seeing is nearly 430 volt amps for the CrossFire RX 480 configuration, and that's versus 240 on a single RX 480. And then of course, if you look at the overclock power draw for the single RX 480, we would draw way more power if we applied that to CrossFire. So you have to take that into account if you're planning to do CrossFire with AIB partner cards that are pre-overclocked. A single GTX 1070 sits at 263 volt amps, and a single GTX 1080 sits at 280.63 volt amps, just for comparison. Moving on to noise, we gained a couple dB across the board with the CrossFire configuration. We're at 38.4 dB idle versus a single RX 480's 37.3 dB output, 41.2 dB auto versus 39.4 dB for the single card, and then 44.9 at 50% versus 42.8 also at 50% for the single card, and 67.4 dB at 100%, which is very loud, versus 65.6 dB for the single card, also at 100%. So although the dB increase looks like maybe 1 or 2 decibels in a lot of cases, and of course this is logarithmic, so it's not just a subtraction addition thing, although that is the case, there's a pretty annoying whine noise that does bring itself out a bit more with CrossFire at the higher fan RPMs, and there's also a slight vibration that's caused from turbulence between the two cards. It's not that annoying. If it's within a case and you're under 50% fan speed, you're probably fine, but past that point it does get to be a bit annoying. Okay, so enough with the power, noise, and thermals. Now we're going to get into the game benchmarks. These are not all of our benchmarks. You can find the rest, again, in the link in the description below. Mordor, Shadow of Mordor at 1080p Ultra. We see a 38.7% increase over the single RX 480. 0.1% lows are a little on the low end, but overall acceptable. And this pairing is 3.9% faster than a GTX 1070. The GTX 1080 is 11.7% faster than the CrossFire RX 480s. Moving to 1440p, we see the poor 0.1% low performance introduce some noticeable stutters and frame drops, but we've improved our averages overall and see a scaling of 72% over the single RX 480. Performance improvement is about 12.4% versus the GTX 1070 Gaming X, or 11 FPS average if you want that number. And that said, the GTX 1070 Gaming X sustains a better 0.1% low performance, and this is generally a trend with multi-GPU configurations versus single. 4K pushes the cards closer together with minimal average FPS gaps differentiating the GTX 1080 and the RX 480s. The GTX 1070 runs at 51.3 FPS average but keeps significantly better 0.1% low frame times than the RX 480s in Crossfire. GTA 5 was retested using the 16.7.1 drivers that resolved stuttering. The rest of these games were tested with 16.6.2. At 1080p, the very high and ultra setting combination we use saw the RX 480s in Crossfire performing at 106 FPS average with slightly lower 0.1% lows than the single RX 480 configuration. There's still positive scaling on the averages since we've seen the single 8GB card runs at 85.3 FPS, and that's a scaling improvement of 19.5%, so not impressive, but definitely present. And 0.1% low values are negatively scaled, with the single card performing nearly 20% better than the two RX 480s strictly in 0.1% low values. At 4K with GTA 5, we're seeing the Crossfire RX 480s pull ahead in the charts and achieve parity with the stack of GTX 1080 GPUs. The Crossfire RX 480s are outpaced only by the AIB partner GTX 1080 from MSI and the SLI GTX 1070s reference cards. Moving on to Black Ops, we're clearly hitting a throttle point at 1080p in the current newest Call of Duty game, for now anyway. With our top few cards hitting a wall around 218 FPS, there's obviously a throttle point. So Black Ops 3 remains one of the better optimized games on the bench and also has a history of posting better AMD performance than in some other titles. The Crossfire cards tie with the SLI GTX 1070s at 1080p, creating a scaling of 39% over a single RX 488GB card, and that's a 132.3 FPS average for the RX 480 as opposed to 218 on the Crossfire cards. At 1440p, we see the SLI GTX 1070s leading the Crossfire RX 480s by 3.5%. Crossfire 1% and 0.1% low performance is acceptable, though is clearly lower overall than the GTX 1070 and GTX 1080 cards, despite maintaining a strong average. The Crossfire configuration shows an increase of 52% over the single RX 48GB card. And moving on to 4K, this is actually playable on Crossfire 480s, though the 0.1% lows do dip low enough to produce visible stutter when playing. It's not ideal, but the average is positioned between the GTX 1080 Gaming X and the SLI GTX 1070s. Average FPS performance is effectively doubled over the single RX 488GB card, but 0.1% low performance remains comparable. Mirror's Edge Catalyst uses a lot of post-processing, which is often interdependent on frames, and that's not great for scalability on multi-GPU configurations. And we're actually seeing negative scaling in Mirror's Edge Catalyst, with a single RX 480 at 1080p Ultra performing 35% faster than the CrossFire cards. So this is an instance where you would definitely want to disable CrossFire to play the game. At 4K high, we're seeing 25 FPS average for dual RX 480s, that's in CrossFire, versus 33 FPS average for a single card. So that's again negative scaling. Granted, the game is not really playable on either device at 4K high, but the scaling is still negative, so it does illustrate that, and that's not what you want when you buy a second video card. We also tested Hyper and 1440p, and you can find more information on that below. Ashes of Singularities. This game's interesting. This one is optimized for MDA, so we used multi-display adapter for this through DX12, and then of course DX11 does not support that quite the same way as DX12 does. It's not optimized the same way. Ashes is where AMD's RX 480s should be expected to perform well, considering their bombastic comparison versus the 1080. Looking purely at frame rates, we're seeing the same poor DX11 performance as we've observed on all of AMD's currently tested cards on our bench, including the Fury X, R9 390X, and RX 480, but that subsides as we switch over to DX12. This inflates AMD's scaling numbers substantially given the poor DX11 performance, so their scaling does look much better than perhaps the actual perceivable output is. But it does help that CrossFire RX 480s outmatch a single GTX 1070 in average FPS at 1080 high, and the two cards nearly achieve parity, the two 480s that is, with the single GTX 1080 single cards. And against a single RX 480, the CrossFire configuration runs 36.8% faster. 4K high posts the CrossFire RX 480s at 59.2 FPS average for DX12, or between the two GTX 1080 cards, and we land above the GTX 1070 Gaming X, and CrossFire then maintains a 41% speed increase over a single RX 480. Frame times are also important to look at. The average frame latency at 1080p high has the RX 480s in CrossFire performing between the GTX 1080 and GTX 1070, and well above the single RX 480 when looking at DX12 strictly. DX11 doesn't really look good for the CrossFire setup, but then again, it doesn't look good for any of AMD's cards on this bench, and it stretches AMD's scaling metrics given the poor DX11 performance. Here's a percent change chart to show scaling from DX11 to DX12 between these cards and architectures. The Talos principle offers both DX11 and Vulkan API benchmarks. With DX11, we're seeing clear scaling between the RX 480s and CrossFire versus the single card option. 1080p Ultra posts an increase of 45.7%. For comparison, dual 1070s posted a performance improvement of 17.4%, which that's of course not that exciting, but the story changes as we look to Vulkan. CrossFire 480s actually post lower Vulkan performance than the single card, than the single RX 480. That's 71.6 FPS Crossfire versus 74.4 FPS for a single RX 480. That makes the single card 3.8% faster at 1080p. Moving to 1440p, we see similar results, with the single 480 actually about 2 FPS faster than dual 480s in Vulkan. Using DX11 instead, we see 153.6 FPS with Crossfire versus 79.8 on a single card. So obviously the API is not favorable towards multi-GPUs at this time, and that is more on the game side. So API matters, and that remains true all the way through 4K, which is playable on DX11 with Crossfire, but totally unplayable when in Vulkan. The Division is another game that shows negative Crossfire scaling. At 1080p high, our tests are showing a performance difference of more than 10 FPS average between the single card and dual cards, made worse by dismal 0.1% low values, and that makes the single RX 480 13.8% faster in averages and 43.6% faster in 0.1% lows than the Crossfire configuration. 1440p is again similar with the RX 480s and Crossfire dragging behind the single card setup, or 56 FPS average versus 51.3 FPS average, and there's an even bigger gap in the lows as we've seen in the last few tests. So that leads us to the question of whether or not this is actually worth it with Crossfire cards. And my answer is the same as it's been for SLI 1070s and SLI everything else we've ever tested for the most part. SLI 970s we did as well. So this it's true for NVIDIA and for AMD. I would presently advise against going with two cards unless you have a very specific game or use case where you know that these cards will be leveraged properly. So if you're playing one game where you know the scaling's good, you play in that game a lot, and it seems worth it in terms of value of spending money on two cards versus more money on one card, then yeah, I guess maybe consider it. But otherwise, for sort of a more general use case, unless you're taking into account production tasks, rendering, what have you. Those things we're not looking at here. But for a general use case, I would say a single card is still better than dual cards, and that goes for SLI and it goes for CrossFire. So I'm making the same statement for both options here. 480s, they have negative scaling in some games, which is clear in Vulkan testing. Of course, it's incomplete right now, but that is a game, and it's something you can play, Talos Principle. So negative scaling there. We're seeing negative scaling in the Division. We're seeing good scaling in Ashes, of course. You'd kind of expect that. They brag on that point. And then we see negative scaling in Mirror's Edge, and we see some spurious performance in terms of the 0.1% low values in other games. And that's normal for multi-GPU. That's where we see the frame latencies are kind of stretching out between frame outputs because of the way CrossFire SLI work. So overall, not necessarily something I'd recommend unless, again, you have a specific use case and you want to do it. But power is higher, of course, than a single card, whether that's a single 1070 or even a single 480 if you'd prefer to drop your performance overall. And then thermals are higher, noise levels are higher, and performance is hit and miss depending on the game. So that's the CrossFire test. These were both 8 GB cards. The results would be different with 4 GB cards. We have a 4 GB versus 8 GB single RX 480 test online. You can see that on the channel. And that shows where sometimes 8 GB makes more sense, but sometimes it doesn't matter. So as always, thanks for watching. Patreon link in the post-roll video. If you want to help us out directly with furthering these projects, subscribe so you don't miss any content. And I'll see you all next time.